All right, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Just a quick disclaimer before we get underway today. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Wendy Drexler of ISTE. I'll take a moment to introduce Wendy now. She is the Chief Innovation Officer and has 23 years of experience in education as an educator, leader, and innovator in K-12 and higher education. She has taught at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. Her corporate experience includes developing a proprietary learning management system, as well as some of the first web-based training programs for global network sales at IBM and AT&T. Prior to joining ISTE, she served as Director of Online Development at Brown University, where she championed its first online and blended courses. She also launched Exploring Engineering, one of the first massive open online courses, or MOOCs, for high school students. Previously, Wendy coordinated the research effort associated with the Title II Enhancing Education Through Technology grant across 23 school districts in Florida. She also serves as the National Association of Independent Schools 21st Century Task Force and consults with schools on the design of blended and online learning programs. Wendy holds a doctorate in education technology from the University of Florida, an EDS in curriculum and instruction, education technology from the University of Florida Gainesville, and a Master of Arts in secondary social studies education from the University of South Florida in Tampa. Her doctoral research focused on student use of Web 2.0 tools to construct personal learning environments. With that, I will hand it over to Wendy.
Thank you, Justin. That was a very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. I also see here that I have some old friends in the room, and it's great to see some of you. And it's nice that we have kind of an intimate group today. I appreciate that you've all taken the time out of your day to attend this session. Some of us are old, and some of us are just old in the way that they're old friends, not old people. I would like this, as I always would like, the webinars to be more of a back and forth. But what I always find is that people are more comfortable typing things in the chat window. And so I will try to track the chat window as we have this discussion or conversation. I also would like to very quickly find out, some of you have put in the organizations that you're with. When Catherine and Justin talked to me about having this or doing this presentation, I was really trying to get a sense if I should focus this talk more from a practitioner's point of view or a research point of view, and I tried to find a little bit of a balance. But do we have any folks on the call, and you can just put in the chat window if you are a teacher or a practitioner versus a researcher, because it just sort of helps me. I think it might help me sway the conversation a little bit more. You can just type in, teacher, researcher, or, what it is that you do, and that would be helpful. And then as we go through the presentation, I'm going to try to take a few stops along the way to see if you have any questions. I'm also going to be putting in a little bit later some different resources that you can go and take a look at. One of the interesting challenges about this concept of personal learning environments, especially in K-12, is that it's very hard if people aren't generally familiar with that term and the differentiation between that term and personalized learning. It's very hard to get a concept in mind. So I didn't want to use time from this presentation to share video, but I am going to share a video later in the presentation that you can look at afterward that I hope kind of pulls it all together if you're having a little bit of a hard time visualizing exactly what this was. I'm going to focus the conversation on my own personal frame of reference and the research that I personally conducted on personal learning environments in K-12. And the approach that we took was very much a blended approach because it was taking place in the classroom and with the concept of online learning taking place within a traditional classroom environment. But I think what's really interesting are the implications that this could have for fully online K-12 learning. So we can talk a little bit more about that later as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Now that I've seen that it looks like we have some teachers who were teachers and some researchers. So I will try to introduce the data where it makes sense. And if afterwards you have questions specific to the data, I can send you all of that separately. All right, so as we get started, one of the things that I think is most confusing, and this is really true of ed tech in general, you know, because the technology is involved and because we're doing new and different things, we're always trying to think of different ways to define or talk about what it is that we're doing. And what happens is that you end up with this terminology that not only could be difficult for people to understand or create a vision of, but that also morphs over time. And we see that with blended learning, the definition of blended learning kind of morphing and changing and sort of living on a continuum. But we also see that with personalized versus personal learning. So I want to take a little bit of time to differentiate between those two. And I would ask all of you in the chat window if you can not necessarily give me a definition of what you think personalized learning is or what it means, but what do you think are some components of personalized learning from a learner perspective? And by the way, I'm perfectly fine if somebody, we have a small group, so if somebody wants to open up the mic and talk, that would be great too, but if you'd rather type it in the chat window, that would be fine as well. So we're looking for what are some of the components or characteristics of personalized learning. Customization to the individual interest and passions. Great. Martin, individualized instruction. And Justin saying if you'd like to use the mic, just raise your hand and he'll enable your audio. Thanks, Justin. Any others? It's interesting because from my perspective, you know, I always was kind of had my focus on this concept of personal learning and personal learning environment. And just a few years ago, we started to hear more and more about personalized learning. And from my perspective, and this doesn't necessarily represent everyone in the field, so I can, you know, say that up front. But from my perspective, this concept of personalized always felt like it was something that was actually being done to you. So rather than something that you're having full control over. So when I think of personalized, I like to use an example like with the car that you see here. You know, this is a Prius, a Toyota Prius, and I can personalize this car in a number of ways. It's still a car, and it's still going to have the same, you know, internal engine in most cases, and that's going to work in the same way. But there are some different features that I can add to this car to make it my own. And in this case, I've chosen the sea glass pearl color of the car. So I've personalized that car in a certain way. As opposed to this concept of personal, in which we actually could create a car that nobody else has or that doesn't look like any other car that you've ever seen before. So here's an example of one that I often see at the, yeah, I know, I would totally drive this car too. And what's interesting is that the sign on the side of it says that it is not for sale versus that it is for sale. But it is often parked in the airport here in Providence, in CF Green Airport. So one day I just snapped a picture of it. So it became in my mind just sort of a great, as Kathy says, metaphor for this concept of the difference between personalized learning and personal learning. And then one other example that I often give to differentiate between the two is the concept of a license plate. And I am a Florida fan, so this is my Rhode Island license plate. It is also personalized. And it's personalized in a very structured way, right? I only, in Rhode Island, I think Florida is 7, but in Rhode Island we have 5 letters, and we can use a combination of letter and numbers, but we can't have a number at the beginning or the end. The numbers can only be in the middle. And so there's a lot of different rules and structure around how I can personalize this license tag. And it's still a license tag. I can't decide that the way that you're going to identify me as different from someone else on the road is that I'm going to paint a big smiley face on the back of my car. So personalized is that there really is structure around it. So when you think of this concept of personal versus personalized, you're really looking at a kind of a continuum, right? Personalized can mean as much as letting a student in a classroom in reading, for example, just select which book they're going to read. And you might define that as personalized. You might also define personalized as we're going to collect data on students. We're going to see how they're doing at any given time, whether they're working within a learning management system or if they're being supported in other ways in the classroom. We're going to look at that data and we're going to make decisions to help that student determine what he or she should be doing next, or at what level he or she should be working. And that's another way we look at personalized. Personalized tends to take place within the current structure, within the structure of a traditional classroom, even though we may be using technology to help us in this personalization process. So I really look at it when I'm talking about personal learning environments, I'm really talking about this balance of control and taking that control and moving it further away from the teacher and more toward the student. And this is not just in the student making simple decisions. It really is starting to get to this concept of the student making specific decisions around how to meet certain standards, for example. Like we may tell the student that you need to learn this or follow this standard, but the student gets to determine how he or she wants to learn that, versus, you know, the teacher having a pretty prescribed method for each student to learn in the classroom. So we're shifting the balance of control more toward the student. It's also, and that's same with the concept of autonomy, it also is based on the whole concept and theory behind the construction of personal learning environments is based on constructivism, connectivism, and the concept of network learning. And one really important, if we differentiate between, Joe has a question, if I differentiate between what a student needs versus what a student wants, that's a great question. And I think that within the realm of, you know, a K-12 classroom, we're not going to get to the point, we're nowhere near getting to the point where we're just focused on the student making all of the decisions. So you also, in the same way that you're having this balance of control between teacher and student and trying to give the student more autonomy, more control of the learning, you're also giving the student more responsibility for the learning. And that means that you're going to help guide that student in what he or she needs to be learning and should be learning that's age appropriate, appropriate for their grade level, or appropriate for where they are in a certain subject, which is still how most schools are traditionally set up. So yeah, I mean, it's not a free-for-all, and actually in the research that we've done that we're going to talk about, there's quite a bit of structure in that environment, but that structure looks very different, you know, when the student is working within their own constructed learning environment. We'll talk more about that. But one thing that's really interesting about network learning that was a huge aha moment for me as I went through learning more about what network learning really is and what it means, is that the connections that we make, we think about if we're doing research, if we're going to go on the internet and we're going to look for something, we typically think about content and we do a search and we find information. And we have to think about, we have to vet that information, understand if that's good information, where it's coming from. But what's interesting about networked learning and this concept of networking is that we're not really just focused on connections with content. We're focused with human connections. How do we connect with other people? Because other people have a lot of good information and we can learn from other people, and humans actually naturally like to learn from other people. So it's not just the connections that we make to content, it's the connections that we make to others. And by others, we want to focus on, experts in a certain field, in a certain subject area, peers who perhaps are studying or trying to learn the same things that we are, and people who we know we can vet and know the resource. Even if we may not know the person, we can easily tell that this is an expert in the field as we connect with that person. It also includes the ways that personal learning environments include the ways that we connect to other content. It includes the tools that we use to initiate those conversations and connections, the tools that we use to organize all of the resources that we find, the tools that we use to communicate, the tools that we use to create the artifacts of the knowledge that we have learned. And, if you think about the way that you manage even your browser, if I were to look at it, everybody that's in this room at the moment, if I were to look at your process, your work process, your desktop, for example, they are all going to look different. It's going to be just like the desk that we sit at when we're working, right? Some of us have a really clear, clean desk. Others of us have stuff all over the place. So personal learning environments, especially as we're helping to scaffold this building process with students, tend to look very different. So there are really no two personal learning environments that look alike. And that's where it starts to become, a little bit more difficult to maintain the kind of structure that we typically see in the traditional classroom. So I think it's helpful, especially from a research perspective. Those of us who have a research background, we really come to our passions about whatever our subject area is, if it's educational technology or something else, learning, teaching, or any unrelated field. There's usually a journey that brings us to this place. And so I think it's helpful just to know a little bit about my own personal learning journey. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it really did inform my path toward this concept of personal learning and network learning. Hold on a second. I just had a Safari talking to me. I think that where this really started to impact me and my work is I made the transition between teaching in a 7th grade classroom to working for IBM. I had so many aha moments. IBM being basically a technology company, yes, but it was paperless. It was paperless when I started working there in 1997. And this was really interesting for me because before I started teaching, the first job I had was working for a defense contractor. So this is a government agency in which every piece of paper is really in like quintuplicate, right? And moving from that into this paper to teaching, which also, my teaching was file cabinets full of all kinds of different things that you use with students, into this completely paperless environment was a real shocking transition. The other thing that was really interesting about IBM is that they practice network learning within their professional development and training. So you were encouraged to reach out to other people anywhere in the organization, anywhere in the world, if there was something that you needed to know about a product, a service, or some aspect of your job. And that was it was handled really well. I mean, you would have during the day through instant messaging or email, you would have people pinging you from all over the organization who looked at what your background was and what you were working on and would come to you and say, can you help with this? Or can you help with that? Or, could you be part of this team? And it was a really interesting approach to learning from my perspective. But there wasn't just the connection to people, there was connection to online resources about every product and service that IBM sold, about everything that was happening in IBM research. There were these red books, they called them red books, which were basically all of the information, technical as well as just overview of the products and services and technologies behind everything that IBM sold. Then there were the tools that we use, like learning management systems and just the workplace. And that time was Lotus, and then we moved to Microsoft while I was still there. But it was basically all of these different tools that allowed you to really contain and organize all of your work information in one space. And that was a real evolution for me. And I wasn't really making any connection with that to learning. That was something that I thought about after the fact. But around the same time, I would say in the early 2000s, I went on my own, personal learning journey around knitting. At the time, I was really, really into knitting. I still like to knit from time to time. But back in the day, if you wanted to make something, you would either, your grandmother would teach you, your mom or your family or friends, or you would go to the local knitting store. If you go online today, and this is not just true of knitting, it's true of just about any topic or passion or hobby that you have, you will find a whole online community of people who also share your passion. With knitting, there were knitting blogs and people would share patterns. There's a website, a social networking website called Ravelry, where people share not just the patterns, they post pictures of what they've created and all the different yarns that they've used. And it's just really this, what I would call individuals constructing knowledge that they can go back and share with each other. So that was another, to me, really interesting aspect of learning, and it really helped me maintain my passion for learning. And then as I moved from the corporate environment back into education and started to work on my doctorate degree, I looked at Alec Couros and some of the work that he had done around the networked teacher, and started to see, well, you know what, this really can also be a way of learning for me as I go through this learning process for my doctoral degree and my graduate degree. So all of this stuff is sort of percolating in the back of my mind as I'm trying to figure out, what it is that I want to focus my research on. So this brings me to my interest in network learning in the classroom. Now, prior to deciding that I was going to do this research in a K-12 classroom on personal learning environments, I did some additional action research as I was teaching in a high school classroom while I was working on my degree. And that was really very much focused on network learning specifically, and the way that we as a class could become a community of learners and interact with other communities of learners in other classrooms. And that could be a whole other webinar, but that further informed this whole research process. So getting to the PLE concept in K-12, what we did is a mixed method. Hold on, I'm grabbing a link here that I'll be able to put in the chat window in just a moment. Okay, so I had some challenges, one of which was to find a public school, middle school or high school classroom where there was access to the kind of technology we would need to use, which in this case would be one-to-one for at least some period of time, with a teacher who was very, very open-minded and willing to kind of go through this experimental process for 9 to 12 weeks, and also be heavily involved in the planning process ahead of time. So there was a bit of challenge, and that took some time. But I did find a teacher to work with at PK Young, which is the University of Florida's lab school. It's a K-12 school. We ended up working with a science teacher in a classroom with about 100 students in 5 different classes. So there were roughly, 20, give or take, students in each class. And while we did some of the surveying and that work in the project with all of the students, I was really focused primarily in one of the classrooms. It was a 9-week unit. We focused on the differentiation between venomous and poisonous creatures or animals. And this was part of the 7th grade science curriculum. So this is where we talked earlier about, trying to create this ability to construct a personal learning environment in an environment that still is going to require some structure, because, there are standards that we need to meet, and there's things that we need to follow from a state and school perspective. And so we focused on content and curriculum that was already being used in the 7th grade class. We allowed the students to use a number of different tools, and some of those are here in the slide. We used Skype to reach out and communicate with experts in the field. We used Google Scholar to look for those experts and to look for research-based information about the different poisonous or venomous creatures. They used Blogger to follow the teacher's blog for some of the daily focus areas that they were going to work on, and they each had their own personal blog to reflect on the learning process. We used Symbaloo as a way for the students to organize their content. When you're dealing with middle school kids, organization is always a challenge. So just similar to their backpacks, their ability to organize this content was a real challenge. We used Evernote for note-taking, YouTube just for content and video, and then their final artifact was basically a Glogster poster that incorporated a number of different types of media. An interesting thing that happened as part of this as well is that the teacher in the classroom was not the only one who was creating the assessment. We actually crowdsourced the assessment by having those experts review the content of the poster and the work that the students had done, giving them feedback and having them go back and review and rework the work that they had done based on the feedback that they received. And we also, in this mixed method study, there were 27 hours of observation, a PLE, their personal learning environment analysis, which was their Symbaloo site and all of the resources that they had linked to or created, and their Glogster posters, and then interviews with the teacher and 2 specific students, one of which was identified through their FCAT scores, that was the accountability testing in Florida, as being above average, slightly above average student, and the other as being one who struggled in both reading and math. So we interviewed both of those students, and then all of that was coded. And in addition to that, we did the constructivist learning environment survey pre-project and then at the end of the project. And interesting, because I was already working with a teacher who I would have defined as a very student-focused constructivist type of having a constructivist philosophy. But yet, even with that, having participated in this project, there was a statistically significant increase in the student perception of the class being a constructivist learning environment. So I'm going to put in the chat window a link to a YouTube video that is called Welcome to My PLE. And after this, well, I'm trying to put it in there. One second. After this, you can go back and take a look, and it will really give you an overview. Oh, it doesn't want to let me click in a link. Not interesting. It will only let me type. If you go to YouTube and search under Welcome to My PLE, it should come right up. So I put that in there. And in that video, one of the students who was targeted for the interviews actually helped to create the video that was an overview of the whole project and talked about the different resources that she used and how that all went. And it's about a 2-minute video. So I think that'll help to really bring all of this together. And also, because this is very difficult to see, I do have a link, and I don't know if maybe we can send that out afterwards, since for some reason it doesn't want me to. I wonder if I try it without the HTTPS. Yeah, it doesn't want me to paste it. I'll have to type it in later. But I do have available a bigger section of this, and we're going to look at it in pieces. Basically, the findings of this, we were focused on what are the processes that students go through as they're constructing a personal learning environment. And there were 5 primary areas that they focused, that the students really were doing on more or less a daily basis. One was practicing digital responsibility. Another was practicing digital literacy, organizing content, socializing and collaborating, whether that was online or with other students in the classroom, even if they weren't working on the same projects. And the last was synthesizing content and creating. So creating some kind of knowledge, constructing knowledge, and having an artifact that really represented their learning. So these were the 5 focus areas, and within each of these focus areas, there were some additional processes. So from a digital responsibility perspective, it was more than just, we often, top of mind when you ask people about digital responsibility, they think of responsible use or acceptable use, and they think about bullying and that kind of thing. But there was really much more to it than that. It was, avoiding inappropriate content, but it was using technology properly and understanding how to use the technology, communicating respectfully, understanding copyright, which was huge. Another thing that was oh, thank you, Catherine. Another thing that was really interesting was the when the students would do search, they would always start their search with an image search, and that was another aha for me. In that, typically when I go to search for something, I search, under the content or sites, and they would start every search with a visual. So they were very much like navigating this learning space from a visual perspective first, and then the content perspective second. And I think I mentioned copyright. Another piece of digital responsibility, which I'm seeing now is becoming more and more important, is this concept of identity. And what does identity mean, and how do we manage identity? But again, that's a whole other discussion. Under digital literacy, we were looking at dealing with technology, again, evaluating resources. We spent a lot of time up front helping the students to understand how to vet resources. Whole lessons were spent initially on that. And this brings up another important point to this research. It's very hard to do something like this in a 9-week time frame when you're not only having them doing the content focus or the subject area focus, but you're actually trying to teach them a fast course on how to become a network learner when they haven't really had that kind of background. So when we think about, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but when we think about what we need to look at going forward, we need to think about how we scaffold this kind of process for students to be able to even learn effectively in this way. So then we had search, best ways to search, using more than just your typical Google search. And what does that mean? Different types of search engines. How do you find things, and how do you find things quickly? And that takes practice. Organizing content, being able to tag for efficient retrieval. So teaching them how to tag, teaching them how to take proper notes and share notes and use web clipping tools rather than just typing in notes. Social bookmarking, using subscription readers like RSS to be able to go back and find or highlight the things that you want to return to. And then managing multiple user accounts. One of the biggest struggles that we had was just the fact that the different tools that the students were using, we had a couple of things. One, we had 7th graders who don't turn 13 till halfway through the school year, so some of them were 13 and some of them weren't. So we had to get special permission from parents that they could use these different resources. But then they had to manage all these passwords. So trying to help them create a password that they didn't necessarily share, but they would be able to remember was one of the interesting hurdles that we had. Collaborating and socializing. We spent a lot of time on debate, interestingly enough, traditional debate and what that means and how do you argue, especially if you're dealing with peers, how do you argue in a logical and respectful manner in an online space? How do you question? What are the types of questions that you should ask? And how do you ask yourselves those questions? And then how do you pursue the answers? And then all different types of communicating, social networks, video conferencing, microblogging, like a Twitter type thing, mobile texting, all of these different ways to communicate with potential co-learners. And then finally, synthesizing and creating. We looked at the reflection process, and this is why the blog was so important, so that the students could go back and reflect on what they had reflected on weeks before. And then producing content. And that was not just through the Blogster posters that they did, but also through, wikis, their blogs, podcasting, text writing, presentation software, video, like the example of the video that Catherine posted where the student really was instrumental in creating that video. So we identified these processes and realized that, for this to be done practically especially in a more traditional learning environment, this concept of scaffolding each of these processes we know is going to be very, very important. And in fact, after this research was conducted, the teacher who was a part of this actually went and started to work at a very, very small school and then opened a school that basically followed this process. And he scaffolded this process throughout the year, and so that the students could, over the years, and actually the years that they were in middle school, because that was the age he was working with, would be able to create these personal learning environments that continue to grow once they even left the classroom. So I'm going to stop there for just a minute before I go into the further research and see if you have any questions. You can either grab the mic or type them in the chat window. Oh, which district in Florida? This was in Alachua County. And actually, PK Young is a school that is its own district. It is a public school, but since it's the lab school for UF, it is a K-12 school that is defined as a separate district. Oh, cool. Okay, so but it's interesting because in going through this process, and you can probably tell, I've tried to go through it pretty quickly, but it's very, very complex. And we know that just network learning is sort of a complex process, and it's also distributed. So it makes it more difficult to track. And there are people who are doing a lot of experimenting. Actually, we know that there's a lot of data analytics going on within what I would call traditional now learning management systems, but there's a lot of experimenting going on within in the field around data collection in distributed learning environments. And when you think about a personal learning environment and having all of them being different, the only way that you're going to be able to get that kind of data collection is through in a distributed fashion. So it's going to be very interesting from my perspective to see where that goes. From a teaching and learning perspective, I think that there's real opportunity to do further research in the construction of personal learning environments that are aligned with teaching standards. This is something that Randy, the teacher I worked with, he really started to do after this project was over, was actually looking at the standards and communicating the standards to the students and having the students make decisions about how they were going to meet those standards. And that was, I wouldn't call that easy to do in every single traditional classroom, but it was doable. And it was also being able to maintain the standards approach and still give the students a lot of flexibility in the learning process. Another thing that I think is so important, and one of the points I was trying to make around, oh, wait, I see a question. How important is it to have those standards for students, and how can those be the most easily implemented at the practice level? And in my various roles, how have you seen those played out? And I think that's kind of what I was saying with Randy and what he did. You know, this is not something that most teachers are going to be able to jump right into and hit the ground running with. And when I look at my own journey, you know, it really started with a single project in a classroom, and then the next year adding a few more tools, and the next year adding a few more, and always looking at what's out there and what are the implications for learning. This is an organic process. And the individual student construction of a personal learning environment is also an organic process. So having a system in which you can maybe start with one standard at a time, with one or two different tools that are best aligned with the educational goals. And that part is so important, because of course we don't want to be focused on the tools, we want to be focused on the learning and what it is the student's trying to learn, and have the tools help in that process. So it's going to be important over time, if we're ever to get to this kind of learning on a scalable basis, to scaffold this approach through the years. And there's a lot of age-appropriate ways to do that. When you think about digital responsibility, for example, that looks very different for a kindergartner than it looks for a middle school student, than it looks for a high school student. So being able to look at the processes instead of the whole picture, like instead of saying, oh, we're gonna focus our attention on having students build personal learning environments, rather than doing that, let's focus our attention on building the processes that help students create a personal learning environment, and as such become a lifelong learner, and giving them more responsibility for the learning process. That's really where we want to focus first. This is just one view of what that might look like down the road if we were able to do a good job of focusing on those processes first. So there's a lot of research that can be done within each of those individual processes and across different age groups. Another thing that's huge here is the implications for the role of teacher, and that's true of all technology integration or technology for learning and teaching. But when we think about how teaching like this changes the role of the teacher and the role of the student, and we have to include both of them in the research and the design process. What are the implications for this in fully online learning environments? As I said, this was done in a blended classroom. Not even, I would call it a blended program, but it was really done in a traditional classroom. What can we do, and what does it mean to transcend the LMS? Right now, most of the online learning that takes place in formal education is within a very structured LMS. It's a pretty big step to go from that to, the open internet. Distributed data collection, I already talked about. And then just what does it mean to facilitate student construction of PLEs and help scaffold them through this process? Love to see some longitudinal studies on what the implications are for self-direction and motivation. And then I mentioned the visual search. I really think that that's something we need to think about in general when we think about instructional design for online learning spaces. And then, I don't know if there's others that any of you have that you might suggest based on what you heard as a result of this presentation. And then just some thinking going forward as you leave the the presentation. How might we take advantage of opportunities for PLEs in K-12? What are the challenges for implementing them in blended or fully online environments? What small steps can you take? And we just talked about a few of those. And what steps might you take to put more of the responsibility for learning on the students? And when teachers ask me, what is the first step? To me, that's the first step. It doesn't even have to be around technology. It's like, how can it be, more them and less us? And when you start thinking about that and actually putting that responsibility on the student, it becomes a little bit easier to take the next baby step towards something more complicated. That's about it. And if you have any questions, if you're looking for additional resources, the one poster that I had here, it's a big long Google Doc, or I would type it in. I don't know why I can't actually cut and paste, but I'll send it to Catherine, and she can send it to the folks on the call if that's possible, or to Justin. And these are all the different places that you can find me. I'm pretty easy to find. And any questions? Okay, guess I'll turn it over to Justin.
I know we all appreciate a lot of the work that you've put into that, and hopefully some folks can get some value out of that. Again, if anyone has any follow-ups for Wendy, please reach out to her using that contact information there. I'll leave it up for just a couple more seconds before we wrap up. We did want to point you to a couple of our ongoing initiatives here at the Institute before we wrapped up today. We have our podcast series called the Virtual Viewpoints Podcast. You can click that link there, which will take you to the site, our home site, where you can see all of the episodes that have been recorded thus far, a little synopsis of each, and then a link to the SoundCloud site where those episodes are hosted. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, if you've got some work or some research that you'd like to share with the podcast, a little bit shorter and more general venue than the webinar, please reach out to me. I will include my email in the chat window. And also, we encourage you to check out our guest blogger program if you're interested in writing for us. If you've got some research or some work that you'd like to share to our audience specifically, click the link there, read more about the details of our guest blogger program. I want to encourage you to attend our upcoming webinar a week from today, Tuesday, June 23rd. This is a rescheduled session. We'll be hosting Michael Barber from Sacred Heart University, who will be giving us an overview of the international landscape of K-12 online and blended learning, another of the chapters that he authored in the recently published handbook that Catherine worked on as well. So I encourage you to join us next Tuesday. We hope to see you there. In the meantime, please reach out to us, offer us some feedback on the webinar sessions themselves or on anything else that we're doing. You can email us at mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking the link there. You can also find us on our social media presences, Facebook and Twitter. Our handles are listed, as well as our LinkedIn page, our YouTube channel, where we host the recordings of all of our webinars for those who want to access them asynchronously. Check out our YouTube channel. We'll be posting the recording of this webinar to our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours or so. So we encourage you to share it with anyone that you think might see some value in it. And you can check out all of our upcoming and scheduled webinars listed on our webinars page at mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. Thank you again, Wendy. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who came out. We appreciate you guys for showing up and participating in the discussion as well. Hope everyone has a great week. Take care.
You too. Thanks so much.